Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the barren landscape. Dry, brittle grass crunched under Caden's boots as he trudged forward, his eyes scanning the endless expanse ahead. There was nothing here, no sign of life, no refuge from the wind that howled through the air like a restless spirit. He had wandered for days, unsure of where he was going or why he even bothered. Behind him lay the ruins of his former life, a world that had cast him out, branded him a traitor. The weight of his guilt pressed down on him like a chain, dragging him deeper into despair with each step. His armor, once polished and proud, was now dull and battered, a reflection of the man who wore it. Caden stopped at the edge of a ridge, looking down into the valley below. There, at the base of the slope, a thick fog rolled in from the east, swallowing the ground and trees in a swirling, impenetrable mist. He had heard stories of this place, the forest of lost souls. It was said that only those burdened by their past could find it, and once inside, they never returned. He tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword, the familiar weight of the blade offering little comfort. What did it matter if he entered? There was nothing left for him out here. At least in the mist, he could lose himself, perhaps find the oblivion he sought. Without hesitation, Caden descended the ridge, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The mist rose to meet him, thickening with every step until it enveloped him completely, blocking out the sky and the sun. The temperature dropped, and a chill settled into his bones, but he pressed on, driven by something he couldn't quite name. As he ventured deeper, the forest around him came alive. Shadows flickered in the corners of his vision, darting between the twisted trees that loomed overhead. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, and strange, haunting whispers seemed to echo through the fog, calling his name. Caden clenched his jaw, refusing to be distracted. His mind, already frayed from years of regret and torment, threatened to unravel, but he had faced worse. He had faced his own people, and that was a betrayal he would never forget. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He turned sharply, his hand instinctively going to his sword. But there was nothing there. Just more fog. More shadows. He shook his head, muttering under his breath. It's just the mist playing tricks on me. But deep down, he knew it wasn't the mist. It was the past, clawing its way back into his mind, dredging up memories he had long buried. Faces of the fallen, voices of the betrayed. His betrayal. He moved on, forcing his feet to keep going, but the forest had other plans. The mist thickened around him, swirling like a living thing, and from its depths, figures began to emerge. Ghostly apparitions, pale and translucent, took shape before him, their eyes filled with accusation. Caden froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew these faces. Every one of them. They were the men he had fought beside, the brothers he had sworn to protect, the ones he had failed. The first figure stepped forward, his voice a cold whisper. "Why, Caden? Why did you betray us?" Caden's throat tightened. He took a step back, but there was nowhere to go. The fog pressed in from all sides, and the ghosts moved closer, their hollow eyes never leaving him. "I had no choice," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I did what I had to." Another figure spoke, this one younger, his face twisted in pain. "We trusted you. We followed you into battle. And you left us to die." Caden's hand gripped the hilt of his sword so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I didn't want it to happen. The words died in his throat. He knew there was no excuse, no justification for what he had done. He had betrayed them, and no amount of explaining would change that. The ghosts circled him now, their faces growing darker, their voices rising in anger. "Traitor! Murderer. Coward. Caden fell to his knees, his head bowed under the weight of their condemnation. I know, he whispered, his voice broken. I know what I did. For a moment, the forest was silent, the ghosts watching him with cold, unfeeling eyes. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they began to fade, their forms dissolving back into the mist, leaving Caden alone once more. He knelt there for a long time, his hands trembling, his heart heavy with guilt. He had thought he could outrun his past, but the forest had proven him wrong. There was no escaping what he had done. Slowly, he rose to his feet, wiping the sweat from his brow. The forest was silent again, the mist swirling lazily around him. But he knew it wasn't over. The forest was testing him, pushing him to his breaking point. He had to keep moving. As Caden pressed deeper into the mist, the forest seemed to shift around him. The trees grew taller, their branches twisted and gnarled, like the bones of some ancient beast. The path beneath his feet became treacherous, the ground slick with mud and roots that seemed to reach out and trip him with every step, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Ahead, through the thick fog, he spotted a faint glow, like a distant fire. His heart quickened. Perhaps there was someone else here, another lost soul wandering the forest. Or perhaps it was something far more dangerous. Either way, he had to find out. He quickened his pace, pushing through the underbrush, his sword drawn and ready. As he drew closer, the glow became brighter, and he could make out the flicker of flames through the mist. Suddenly, a voice called out, soft but clear, Caden. He stopped in his tracks, his blood turning to ice. The voice was familiar, painfully so. Caden, come closer. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped forward, the fog parting to reveal a small clearing. In the center stood a figure, cloaked in shadow, illuminated by the firelight. Caden's breath caught in his throat. It was her, Serena. He had not seen her in years, not since the day of the betrayal. She had been the one he loved, the one he had fought for, and the one he had left behind when everything fell apart. But she couldn't be here. She was dead. Serena, he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. The figure turned, and for a brief moment, he saw her face, soft, beautiful, exactly as he remembered. But there was something wrong. Her eyes were cold, empty, devoid of the warmth they once held. You left me, she said, her voice hollow. You left us all. Caden took a step back, his hand tightening on his sword. I didn't want to. I had no choice. Serena's expression darkened, her voice rising. You always had a choice. You chose yourself over all of us. Caden shook his head, his chest tight with guilt. I thought I was doing the right thing. The right thing? Serena's voice dripped with venom. You abandoned us. You let them die. I tried to save you. Caden's voice cracked, his heart pounding in his chest. I did everything I could, but it wasn't enough. Serena stepped closer, her eyes burning with anger. You could have stayed. You could have fought with us. But you ran. You ran and left us to die. Caden's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground, his head in his hands. I didn't mean for it to happen. I thought I could fix things. I thought if I left, I could come back stronger and save you. Serena's face softened for a moment, but the sadness in her eyes remained. You can't fix the past, Caden. You can't undo what's been done. Tears welled up in Caden's eyes as he looked at her, his voice trembling. I know I failed. But I've carried that guilt every day since. It's eaten me alive. Serena knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. You have to let it go. You can't keep punishing yourself for something you can't change. Caden shook his head. I don't know how. I don't know how to let go. For a moment, there was silence. Then Serena's voice, soft and gentle, whispered in his ear. Forgive yourself, Caden. That's the only way. Caden's chest tightened as he looked into her eyes. Could he forgive himself? After everything he had done, could he truly find redemption? Serena stood, her form beginning to fade into the mist. The forest can help you find your way, but only if you're willing to face your deepest fears. Caden's heart ached as he watched her disappear into the fog. He wanted to call out to her, to beg her to stay, but he knew she was gone. Just like everything else he had lost, alone again, Caden stood, his legs trembling beneath him. The mist swirled around him, thicker than before, but something had changed. The weight on his chest had lifted, if only slightly. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, his resolve strengthened. He would not run anymore. He would face whatever the forest had in store for him, no matter how painful. As he ventured deeper into the mist, the air grew colder, the shadows darker. The forest seemed to twist and shift around him, the trees growing taller and more menacing. But Caden pressed on, his heart steady. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time had no meaning here. The fog thickened, obscuring everything around him, and the eerie silence pressed in from all sides. Then, without warning, the ground beneath Caden's feet gave way. He fell, tumbling down a steep slope, his body slamming against rocks and roots as he plunged into the darkness. Pain shot through his limbs, but he couldn't stop the fall. The mist swallowed him whole. When he finally hit the ground, the impact knocked the breath from his lungs. He lay there for a moment, gasping for air, his body aching. Slowly, he pushed himself up, wincing at the sharp pain in his side. His surroundings had changed. The trees were taller here, their branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out what little light remained. The mist was thicker, swirling like a living thing, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, and in the distance, something moved. Caden's heart quickened as he rose to his feet, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his sword. He scanned the darkness, his eyes straining to make out the figure that shifted just beyond the edge of his vision. A low growl echoed through the forest, and Caden drew his sword, the familiar weight of the blade a comfort in the oppressive gloom. The creature emerged from the shadows, its form monstrous and twisted. It was like nothing Caden had ever seen, a hulking beast with dark, matted fur and glowing red eyes that burned with malevolent intelligence. Its claws, long and razor-sharp, dug into the earth as it advanced, its growl rumbling through the ground. Caden's grip tightened on his sword. This was no ordinary foe. This was the embodiment of his deepest fears, the manifestation of the guilt and shame he had carried with him for so long. The creature lunged at him, and Caden barely had time to raise his sword before the beast was upon him. The force of the attack sent him staggering back, his feet slipping in the mud as he fought to keep his balance. The beast snarled, its claws swiping at him with brutal precision. Caden ducked and rolled, narrowly avoiding the lethal strike. He could feel the heat of the creature's breath on his skin, and the stench of death filled his nostrils. With a roar of defiance, Caden swung his sword, the blade slicing through the air with deadly intent. The creature howled as the steel bit into its flesh, but it did not falter. It came at him again, relentless, its glowing eyes locked on his. Caden fought with everything he had, his body moving on instinct, but the creature was powerful, and the weight of his past dragged him down like a leaden chain. For every strike he landed, the creature retaliated with twice the force, and Caden knew he couldn't keep this up for long. But then, in a moment of clarity, Serena's voice echoed in his mind. Forgive yourself, Caden. The words hit him like a bolt of lightning. This creature, it wasn't just a physical enemy. It was his guilt, his shame, his self-hatred, given form. And no matter how hard he fought, he could never defeat it with violence. Caden stepped back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The creature paused, sensing the shift in him, its red eyes narrowing. "I'm not going to fight you anymore," Caden said, his voice steady. The creature snarled, advancing on him, but Caden stood his ground. He lowered his sword, letting it fall to the ground with a dull thud. "I forgive myself," he whispered, his chest tightening with emotion. "I forgive myself for what I did." The creature hesitated, its glowing eyes flickering. For a moment, it seemed to waver, its form growing less distinct. Caden took a deep breath, his heart steady. "I forgive myself," he repeated, louder this time. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, and then, slowly, it began to dissolve, its dark form breaking apart and fading into the mist. Caden watched as the last remnants of the beast vanished into the fog, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The weight that had pressed down on his chest for so long was gone, lifted like a heavy cloak. He stood there for a moment, breathing in the cool, damp air, feeling the forest around him shift and change. The mist that had once been thick and oppressive began to clear, revealing the true beauty of the forest: tall trees with vibrant green leaves, birds singing in the distance, and the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the canopy. Caden smiled, a small, tentative smile, as he picked up his sword and sheathed it. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain: he was no longer the man who had entered the forest of mist. He had found his redemption, not through violence or penance, but through acceptance. As he turned to leave the forest, a voice echoed softly in his ear, Serena's voice, warm and kind. "Go, Caden. Live your life. The past no longer holds you." With a final glance at the forest, Caden stepped out of the mist and into the light, ready to face whatever the future held.